The 2025 International Colloquium Series Europe is sponsored by Union Theological Seminary in the city of New York, the Episcopal Diocese of California, King's College London, Regent's Park College, University of Oxford, the Center for Black Theology at Regent's Park College, Oxford, the Protestant Theological Institute of Paris, and in partnership with the Cathedral Church of the Holy Trinity, the American Cathedral in Paris.
The Northern California Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Community Foundation is dedicated to promoting justice, health, education, and service. Please consider making a donation at NorcalMLKFoundation.org. Every donation makes a difference.
Well, here we are. Our evening is entitled Black Theology and Ministry Consultation. It comes on the back of a vibrant conversation we had this morning at Regent's Park College, where we were discussing the past and future of black theology with 4 esteemed guests from the United States, more from whom in a moment. But first, let me give my thanks to our musical accompanist, that is Ben Malonga. Has been serenading us really for the last half an hour or so. And again, we will hear more from Bernard shortly in terms of his, conversation really about the role of music and how that has always been a conveyance for perhaps creating a soundtrack for the black liberation struggle. In his particular case, in terms of South Africa, so we look forward to hear more of that. But I guess the truth is actually wherever African folk have lived and wherever we have tried to make sense of our existential travails, there's always been music. And there's always been other forms of cultural engagement as we seek to engage with the divine and to make sense of the nonsense that has often faced us. This evening is very different in many respects from this morning, but it's not a major departure. That as coins have 2 sides, and so one side of the black liberation coin is the scholarly work that we were witness to this morning. Fine minds who have wrestled with deep, penetrating theological questions around meaning and truth. But this evening, if we flip the coin over, what we're also looking at are some of the resources that have helped black theology not simply to be an academic, scholarly enterprise, but something that has its roots in the faith conviction of ordinary folk. In spaces like this, in church, in places where we have sought a sanctuary away from the world, and yet it's also been a place of empowerment that has enabled us to go back into the world and to be salt and light. And so this evening what we're going to do is a number of things. In a moment I'm going to invite some of my colleagues to come and share something of themselves, not just the academic scholarly bit, but also what some of the resources that inform their ministry. I use that word quite deliberately because I know all of them have a commitment to doing black and women's theology beyond just a classroom and beyond just a seminar. We were talking this afternoon about all our various friends and colleagues. And we know that we have some brothers and sisters who would be somewhat wary about the use of ministry in order to describe the kind of work they were doing. of course, like we could not possibly out them on this occasion. But like we do know that there are some brothers and sisters who don't sit quite so well with the notion that our scholarly work is ministry, our scholarly work is part of our sense of being disciples of Jesus. But that is certainly the case for the four people who are with us this evening. And also with our brother over here from South Africa. I first met Bernard last September, I believe, when I had the opportunity to go to the University of South Africa. I have a link with UNISA. Actually, as does Dwight as well, actually. Actually, both of us are Professor Extraordinarius. I'll say that again because, let's face it, that's a fancy title. Professor Extraordinarius. That's what both of us are. Actually, I once said that. First time I got the title in 2015, and my nephew, who was then 7, said, "Uncle, you sound like a character from Harry Potter." I never used it again. So, the more prosaic one is Extraordinary Professor, which still kind of sounds ridiculous, but it's Professor Extraordinarius. And we were in Pretoria, and then I think we were in KwaZulu-Natal. I think it was in Durban. In Durban for a consultation that was looking at jazz music and black liberation. And Bernard told me that he was coming to the UK to do his doctoral studies at Canterbury Christ Church University. And hopefully maybe say a little bit about that study. So once I knew he was coming here, I was determined that we were going to find some occasion to bring him to Oxford. And so we are really grateful that you come here as such a gifted musician. I was sent for piano lessons when I was 9 years old by my mom, because she was determined that someone in her family should be musical. She always loved music, so I went for piano lessons. Except I didn't go to piano lessons, I skipped and took the money and played football with my friends. I don't know how I thought I would get away with this. Whereas I would come back and she would say, "Are you practicing that?" And I would say, "Yeah, Mum, I'm really getting really good." So eventually when we were at church one day and she said, "Oh, but Anthony has been practicing. Anthony, show me what you've learned." Well, let's just say that there is obviously, we're in a different era now where we talk about spare the rod and spoil the child. Well, obviously that was not in existence when I was growing up. Let's just say that the rod and my backside were well acquainted, as my mother was not happy with the fact that I had wasted several months of money playing football rather than learn to play the piano. Obviously, therefore, I look across at the brother and I think about what could have been, I could have been Oscar Peterson. I could have been theologian instead I was just a failed crappy football. So thank you for everything that you will share with us this evening, Bernard. So our first section is really thinking about black and women's theology and the role of music and art and culture in its broadest sense as a way of informing our scholarship. And I know that one of the things that we often do, actually when we talk about art, is the art of being able to read the Bible and how we interpret it. So in a moment I'm going to invite Andrea, so this is a kind of heads up that you're up first, to come and say something about the way in which womanists have been able to find creative ways of engaging the Bible. What Dwight shared with us this morning, for those who were able to join us, is that one of the sources for black theology is Scripture, it's the Bible. And part of the genius ways in which black people have been able to read the Bible is to mine it for meaning, but not to get tied down necessarily in terms of literalism. I would say that one of the struggles we have at the moment in terms of our present epoch is that black folk have always been creative in terms of how we've been engaged with the text, and yet I think one of the things that, one of the bad habits we picked up from white American conservatism is this sudden need for us like to be fundamentalists and read the Bible as if it's this fixed truth that you prove text. And the truth is that is not, historically, that's not how black folk have ever read the Bible. We've always read it with our human experience in mind. So we've always had the ingenious ability to be able to read it and read between the lines in order to ensure that the text speaks to the reality of our context. So there's an art in doing that. There's an art in how we have always been able to read text and find its relevance to our context. And so I will invite Reverend Dr. Andrea Dwight to come and share a few words. And then that will be followed by Dr. Dwight Hopkins. And Dwight, you can just do your own thing, Dwight. And then following that, we'll have Dr. Raymond Carr. And because I wouldn't dare to tell a man who sports a fedora like that what he should do. So you just come and do your own thing, brother. And then that will be followed by Dr. Grizzell. So, in that order, Andrea, please.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
What a wonderful day this has been. Just wonderful to see what Oxford is all about in all its dimensions. I have a couple thoughts I want to share. If I may, I'm going to actually double dip here and address. I want to say something about biblical hermeneutics, and I also want to say something about the arts, and particularly why womanist theology is interested in the arts. So maybe I'll actually start there. I want to share that I teach a class called Womanist Theology in the Arts, and one of the things that I do with this class is I very selfishly use my students by asking them to bring contemporary expressions of Black women's art to the classroom so that I may learn what contemporary expressions are. I learned so much about pop culture, but also obscure artists that I would never have heard of without my students. And this, it's almost hard to describe and to put into words. It's a little bit mind-blowing, the ways in which my students connect religion and the arts in ways that I never even imagined. And one of the reasons why this is critical for womanist theology is because when I teach my class, I go through the arts in different expressions. So I will start with visual arts and visual culture, and that's of course because when we're talking about race and gender oppression, we are talking about something that is visible, perceptible. There's an aesthetic to race logic, and so the visual gets privileged, and I try to subvert that a little bit, but we start with visual arts and visual culture. And then we turn to literary arts, and this is a really important moment in the class because Katie Cannon is famous for privileging Black women's literary tradition as a source for theology, for womanist theology. There's something about the way the literary is offering representation of Black women's experience and Black women's life that I think captures, this is my language, not hers, but something ineffable about Black women's experience, something that can't quite be captured except in its artistic expression. And there's something about the story that also highlights Black women's sense of narrative identity in storytelling, which can also be subversive. And then we do performing arts with music, and I use Kelly Brown Douglas and her book Black Bodies in the Black Church, A Blues Slant. I love this book of Kelly's, and it's funny, I know we're being recorded. I hope she doesn't mind me sharing this. I'm gonna out her a little bit. She says she doesn't actually like this book of hers. I think this book is brilliant. I love this book. And she talks about the wild and wicked, sensuous Jesus in this book. But there's something about Black women's expressions of performing arts in the blues that also gets at something theological, which is just can be really, really compelling in the classroom. Then I turn to dance. And dance is important because, of course, womanists are interested in the body and the ways in which bodies move through space and time, and the ways in which Black women navigate their sense of self, their sense of agency with their body. And also, again, like the literary, well, like any art form, there's something ineffable about the way the body moves that wounds up being kind of political counter to what happens to Black women's bodies, which are, in my view, they're almost never removed from the auction block. Black women's bodies are almost always viewed as if they are commodities for sale, and sexually exploitable. And in fact, I'll go so far as to say, and I'm citing Tracy West here, well, she's she says, Black women can't be raped. And the reason she makes this provocative claim is because there's this conception of the Black woman's, she's a Jezebel with an insatiable sexual appetite. So she is literally unrapeable. So a lot to say about the body and a lot to say about dance in this respect. And then I do cinematic arts. I have it's actually against my religion to assign my own work, but in this case I make an exception. I wrote an essay there's a collection of essays on Tyler Perry's films, and womanist reproduction of, oh goodness, what's the title of the book? Womanist and Black feminist responses to Tyler Perry's productions. And in this book, I've got an essay called Screening God, where God literally gets screened on the film screen, but also screened through the lens of the Black male gaze. And so I'm critiquing Tyler Perry here, and I start off that essay by saying, basically, he could use a womanist theology class. And then I turn to Black aesthetics, and I turn to art and politics in Black life. I use Farah Jasmine Griffin and her book on Harlem Nocturne, Kevin Quashie's book called Black Aliveness or a Poetics of Being, and Stephen Best's amazing essay on thinking like a work of art in his book None Like Us, Blackness, Belonging, and Aesthetic Life. So let me just now quickly pivot. I will try not to take too much more time here, but I do want to say something about biblical hermeneutics, because scripture is a source we'll credit James Cone here. One of the things that he does is he does Black theology, and I think James Evans is the one who makes this point. Some of you may remember this better than I do. James Evans says that what's distinctive about the way James Cone is doing Black theology, because we had Major Jones and some other figures before him who were also doing Black theology, but what enables James Cone to put Black theology on the map, and why he's called the father of Black theology, according to James Evans, is that there's something about the biblical tradition as a source for what he's up to in Black liberation theology. So I'm going to just give you a couple interesting lines straight out of James Cone. He says, "To know God is to experience the acts of God in the concrete affairs and relationships of people, liberating the weak and the helpless from pain and humiliation. There is no truth about Yahweh unless it is the truth of freedom, as that event is revealed in the oppressed people's struggle for justice in the world." And notice he begins this claim with reference to the acts of God as they are revealed in Scripture, in concrete affairs. He spends a lot of time on the Exodus event. God is revealed by means of acts on behalf of a weak and defenseless people. In the Exodus Sinai tradition, Yahweh is disclosed as the God of history, whose revelation is identical with God's power to liberate the oppressed. And let's see, I'm going to skip here because I don't want to be up here too much long. He says the biblical idea of God's righteousness is the divine decision to vindicate the poor, the needy, and the helpless in society. He says our chief difficulty, and by the way, I'm citing, this is from one of my favorite of his books, Black Theology and Black Power, his very first book, published in 1969. He says our chief difficulty in coping with the relationship between Black power and Christian love arises from the theological failure to interpret the New Testament message of salvation in such a way that it will have meaning for oppressed Blacks in America. I think that's a pretty provocative claim. Okay, and then I'm going to turn to a couple examples from womanists, and I'm going to just give you 3 quotes. Renita Weems is a scholar of biblical studies, Hebrew Bible, and she writes, womanist hermeneutics of liberation begin with African Americans women's will to survive and thrive as human beings. Excuse me, the interests of real flesh and blood Black women are privileged over theory and over the interests of ancient texts, even sacred ancient texts. Notice the difference here between what Renita Weems is doing with the biblical text as a biblical studies scholar over and against the hermeneutical privileging of Scripture in James Cone's case. Going on, she says, it must be understood as a politically and socially drenched text invested in ordering relations between people, legitimating some viewpoints and delegitimizing other viewpoints. And Dolores Williams spends a lot of time talking about Hagar, and there's a lot to be said about her reading of the Hagar narrative. I'm going to give you 2 quotes. I am suggesting that for a theological interpretation of what this Hagar appropriation can mean for the African American Christian community, a level of interpretation is needed prior to historical critical analysis. It is the prior level of cultural interpretation. And last one, especially during slavery, African Americans did not accommodate themselves to the Bible, they accommodated the Bible to the urgent necessities of their lives. And so this is a kind of a flipping the script, right? So there's a privileging of Black women's experience as the source and accommodating the Bible to the necessity of their lives. So Black women's experience is the foundation, it's the starting point for reading Scripture. So that's a really interesting, if you will, biblical hermeneutics. And by the way, hermeneutics just simply means a theory of interpretation, so how we interpret. I'm going to stop there, and we'll the next person come up. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Anthony Reddie, for hosting us in the academy and now in the church. I'll just say a couple of words about the Bible interpretation, Black theology, Black churches. I was born in Richmond, Virginia, and tail end of segregation, legal segregation. And so we were born into Cedar Street Memorial Baptist Church, which Benjamin E. Robinson was the senior pastor. And that particular church, to me, embodied various strands of first-generation Black liberation theologians. I can recall that in that church, there was a strong emphasis on the Bible. There was also a strong emphasis on Black family. There was also a strong emphasis on each one, teach one. And there was a strong emphasis on personal responsibility to before the anger of God. This is a Southern Baptist at that time. And looking back, it reminds me of a couple of first generation Black theologians, specifically J.D. Otis Robertson's interpretation of the Bible. He was the only first generation Black liberation theologian to write a book on Black theology and the Black family. And he grew up that traditional, he was old income, where the family, was a Baptist, and the family gets together, and the father sits at the head of the table, and the mother sits at the other end of the table, and the children sit on each side, and the father gives the prayer, and before you eat, and then you act accordingly. And I actually shared a dinner or two at his house in Maryland when I interviewed him for my PhD dissertation, so he hadn't come down. And it just brings to mind it being how I grew up in that first church of the biblical interpretation of J.D. Otis Roberts, how he was weaving together both the justice part, but also the reconciliation part, and the importance of taking seriously the Bible as a way of being, guiding us as a way of being in the real world around personal responsibility, the importance of his understanding of the family, as well as building community. That sort of old school, each one teach one, which was propagated particularly with the Negro Women's Club, which was the first civil rights organization in the United States. It was not the NAACP. It was the Black Women's Club, Negro Women's Club. They first met, I think, 1896. Mary Church Durrell, on and on, they were all part of that. And then the second national Black civil rights organization was 1909 Civil Rights Movement. So we often leave out who originated that. And so J.D. Roberts comes to mind, particularly with my own story, being born into, you're born into the church, right? So, but at the same time, the particular Baptist church that my father went to, and the type of one that we grew up in was, I call it inflected or impacted or contextualized by the Episcopal Church. Because as you know, Virginia is the anchor colony in the 13 colonies, and also the anchor for the first 3 or 4 presidents when the country was formed. And so we grew up in a real Episcopalian environment, even though we were in the Southern Baptist segregated part of the Christian community. And J.D. Roberts has that part of his, particularly his earlier understanding of the Bible. He got his PhD here in the UK, like 1959 or something, on Platonism, early Christian Platonism, before he moved toward Black liberation theology in 1971. So reading the Bible, the experience I had, and now connecting the dots, he comes to mind, particularly with my early experience. And then my father wanted me to have a better education, so he sent me to a boarding school, Groton, all boys boarding school, Episcopal boarding school for 5 years in Massachusetts. And there too, I began to see, and again, I'm connecting the theologians to my experience. I had no idea about Black theology. When I first heard about seminary, I thought it was a typo. I thought they meant cemetery. And so that's what I thought about Union Theological Seminary when I first heard about it. There are these different strands of first generation Black liberation theologians impact hermeneutics, interpretation of the Bible, began to cross-pollinate. Still drawn to that sort of J.D. Otis Roberts Sarn definition of family, each one teach one, which is old school, 19th century, early 20th century Black civil rights, calm, justice type of Black interpretation of the Bible. But also too, looking back too, that when I entered college and even when I entered high school, there was a period of, the remaining parts of Black power and Pan-Africanism. So there was a social justice part, which to me combined both Cone's interpretation of the Bible, which Andrea has done a brilliant, synopsis of that. But at the same time, looking back now, and I haven't been exposed to the historian religion of any color. Charles Houston Long, where this whole question of ultimate orientation being an understanding of religion, and Aaron did I don't know if you were here this morning, but Aaron, this clear explication of Long's definition of religion, began to be impacted too, using Long's understanding of religion, of ultimate orientation, of place and location, how we see the world. And because, interesting, that took me out of the church and the Bible, because 5 years in a 1% ruling class boarding school experience, I left the church and left the Bible. But what happened was my interpretation of church and Bible was really the death of an old God. Some of the Southern Baptist death of a God. And so an interesting way looking back and connecting the dots, appreciating the decisive intervention in the academic study of religion across any trend that is Charles Long, helped me to be liberated from a certain form of Christianity and a certain type of dominant grip that a doctrinaire, God will spank you down if you don't wash your hands after. We had, actually in the boys' bathroom in my church in Virginia, there was a picture of bloody Jesus on the cross, and it says, wash your hands or God will get you. So I'm like a little 8, 9 year old. Yes, too. So that God, that church, that old conservative southern part began to die, and God died, the church, and the Bible died for me. But in an interesting way, I still used to listen to the AM station of Black church sermons every Sunday in Roxbury. So it's really left a certain form of biblical hermeneutics, but began to open myself up to the possibilities. What could the Bible offer me anew? So in that sense, it helped me to reread the Bible from my perspective. Somewhat of a Charles Long, how I would interpret him, helping me to reread the Bible, and then beginning to see that, in fact, rereading the Bible, there's amazing passages like the Luke chapter 4 social justice stuff. So it's a mixture both of Laconian, my interpretation of belonging, helping me read the Bible, as well as some loosening of the old-time conservative reading of the Bible, which I think to a certain degree, not totally, that J.D. Otis Roberts might have had, on a young Dwight Hopkins. And after that, I went to college, and that was like the crowning impact on how to do biblical hermeneutics. And then the Laconian thing, I didn't even know James Cone, but we were linking spirituality, not so much the Bible and the church, with social justice, with organizing, with protests, with building takeovers, with all kinds of, as we were getting our cum laudes and summa cum laudes, working hard, but also organizing as well. And clearly looking back, the community and the movements in my student part of my life, James Cone's interpretation of the Bible, as Andrea mentioned, liberation, social justice, international solidarity. We were involved in, even in college back in the day, we were involved in anti-apartheid work in South Africa, supporting Nelson Mandela, long before it became, 20 years before it became mainstream. So again, linking struggle. We were no Stark and Carmichael, just a small group, study group of progressive, Black, and also third world, and also white working class students working around those issues. So much I was impacted by what I now know would be the James Cone's interpretation of the Bible, i.e. Black liberation theology, that I was moved to initially delay, take a 1-year gap year before going to graduate school, and went to Harlem, New York, and became an organizer, old school Harlem. I don't know if you read the autobiography of Malcolm X, but that was the old school Harlem. Now it's gentrified, which is cool, but that if you read the autobiography of Malcolm X, or if you saw Spike Lee's Malcolm X with Denzel Washington, that was the Harlem. And a friend of mine from college, we drove down from Cambridge. It was an old tenement building. We just moved in, slept on the floor. That was old school. Couldn't do it now. But that's how we started organizing, just like that. And the spirituality deepened now because I was immersed in the Black community and the real urban so-called ghetto in New York. I mean, they said if you can make it in New York, you can make it anywhere. And we were pretty successful. Again, located block by block, not the whole borough, the whole city, but I've always been localized, rooted somewhere. And we were pretty successful. And I began to see even more of the power of people who are in the movements for struggle and how spirituality could enhance that for people in struggle. And again, I was pulling snippets from my memory of the Bible there, but I was not a Bible-thumping person at that point. So I guess the Conian interpretation became much more dominant in my own journey. as a young person in my 20s, early 20s, as I tried to come to terms with what does Jesus, what does who do black people, and what does spirituality all have to say for people who are struggling daily and for the ultimate reality for themselves, their families, and their communities. I was so convicted and struck by Cone's interpretation of the Bible that it changed the course of my life. So just to give you an example, I was, rooted in the community in Harlem for the 1 year of gap year turned into 5. And then a friend of mine who had come down from college with me from Boston, initially he gave me a 2-page back-to-back article. He said, "White left must deal with racism." Initially I put it away, and then literally something moved me, which I now call the Spirit, to reread it maybe about 3 weeks later. And I still have it. It's in goldenrod, Xerox. We had a Stepman is about it. We had like a Stepman, not even a Xerox machine. And that's when I saw this guy with a big afro. I heard of theology, I heard of seminary, black theology, and progressives yoking together liberation, justice with biblical interpretation, church formation. And so I called him, and usually in the summertime is when we do our research. We're not there, right? But he was there. He picked up. And he said, "Can you come tomorrow or day after?" I said, "Yeah, I can come." And so I went to his office on the 6th floor of Brown Tower at Union, and we talked for like 4 or 5 hours, everything, but black theology. And he said this to me. He said, "You go down to the second floor to Reverend Bonnie Roseborough, who's head of the MDiv program, and you tell her 3 weeks from now you will be entering the MDiv program." And I was like, "Okay, did I come here to go to seminary?" And that's exactly what happened. So clearly his way he was sharing, he was opening the Bible and how he interpreted it, literally, look at the foot of the giant there, didn't realize it at the time. And that really impacted how I was influenced by black theology's hermeneutic, particularly biblical hermeneutic. That is his form, which has to be socially contextualized. And I'll bring it to a brief, use my own story. So when I was working on my PhD dissertation, which is Black Theology in USA, South Africa, Politics, Culture, and Liberation, Cone said, "You have to go interview all the people in the first iteration who attacked me." It was a beautiful, to be able to tell your student, go, and so I interviewed all of them, 12 of them, Major Jones, J.D. Roberts, Vincent Harding, Cecil Glenn Cone, Preston Williams, missing some, but it was a total of 12, and actually drove across the country visiting them. And they all, for me, began to impact how I understood biblical hermeneutics. And it seems to me that black theology, as a first generation, as a cohort, as a group, was very interdisciplinary and very intertextual. And above all things, the Bible was seen as a context. And it varied, but there were some who would have seen that, Howard Thurman. And we have Dr. Aaron Grizzell, which is one of the world's leading scholars on Howard Thurman. When Howard Thurman's grandmother was enslaved, and when she was free, young Howard Thurman would read the Bible to her, and he was reading Paul's section on slaves obey your masters, and she said, "No, don't read that to me," and I'm paraphrasing, maybe beefing up a little Baptist preacher metaphor, because that ain't in the Bible, and tear it out, right? So here you have a concrete example of a layperson reinterpreting and contextualizing how particularly poor and working class black people read the Bible. So again, to me, I was greatly impacted along my journey of the first generation at various points. And I think as Andrea was mentioning, the various forms of black liberation theologians in first generation. Combs obviously would read the Bible from the liberation part. J.D. Roberts would read the Bible from both liberation and reconciliation, a theology of healing. You would read others like William, a great theodicy person. Who was it? William R. Jones, who would read the Bible, and he understood, first of all, if black liberation theology presupposes liberation, then it has to presuppose the presupposition before liberation, which is suffering, which is raising a huge challenge in how he interpreted it. And there was a period of my life where I also was struggling with humanism, and which now actually has been my lifelong project, has been the co-constitution of the soul, as I read the text as a second-generation Black liberation theologian. And that really comes from my circling back to my father, which was the first sentence in what I said. His biblical interpretation was this: God will make a way out of no way, but God helps those who help themselves. So that's my co-constitution of the soul.
So I have a question, my brother. So I know it's free when we're going to roll, and then we're going to come to this. We're going to talk about it again. Is that what we're going to do? Yeah, I think my tongue's all conflicted. It's okay. All right. Just want to make sure. How you all doing today? Good. Got a whole clap. It sounds like sexual chocolate back there. Drop the mic. Hey, look, I wanted to say a few things to you about my work. And first, let me just say again, I want to thank Dr. Reddie for pulling this all together and for us being able to have this opportunity. And I'm just pleased to be a part of this and to be sharing my work, my life, my interests across the pond with you. Now, I want to say something, some words that have just come up that I want to pick up on and tie this to my work. It was Charles Long who said that America, and again, you can think about your country in the same way, America is a hermeneutical situation. I want you to think about that for a second, okay? Oxford is a hermeneutical situation across the pond. So you are already in a situation where there's a conflict of meaning or some kind of meaning that's being taken place already. And if you're black, right, that meaning has been already magnified in some way. So when I think about my own life, I stopped to ask Dr. Reddie a question because I didn't know if I was going to talk about my biography first or tell you some things about my biography or about my work that could help you and yours when I was reading the list. Okay, because he said, what's the role of music in propagating the disciplines and this kind of thing. So let me say a few things about my biography so you can see at least my hermeneutical situation, and then I'll go into some of my work. I grew up across the highway from the first black asylum in America, which started in 1870. The name of that asylum today is Central State Hospital. The name of that asylum used to be Central Lunatic Asylum for the Colored Insane. So I want you to remember that because that language of that place has changed, right? Because they used to call hospitals, these asylums, lunatic asylums. We don't do that today. So I go right across the highway from it. Now, one of the things when you study that background, that asylum is built on a plantation called the Mayfield Plantation. We don't know that, only in a museum sense that we know that was a plantation. The highway that's across the street, or the street the highway that you have to go over to get in my neighborhood, is called Jefferson Davis Highway. And for those of you who don't know American history, Jefferson Davis was the Confederate president. You see? So now what you're seeing is, in many ways, a hermeneutical situation unfolding. You have a small black community that's across the highway from this kind of facility, right? And I'm coming out of that. When you tell black history, you're often telling white hypocrisy. They sort of go together. And if you ignore that history, you ignore that hypocrisy. That's why it's important to see that we are in this hermeneutical situation, where meaning is going to come out of that situation. And it doesn't mean it's all bad. It's like Aaron was saying earlier, don't pathologize that. That doesn't mean that my situation can't be beautiful. So that shaped who I am. Now, what's interesting about where I'm from, and Dwight Hopkins really knows it, Dwight is from Richmond, Virginia, and I'm from Petersburg, Virginia, a really small town that I'm from that's quite different from the background that Dwight comes out of. You know, I'm the kind of kid that grew up that had a pump in their yard and an outhouse in the yard. I was raised by my grandpa. My mama died when I was in the 10th grade, you see? I'm named after a man that's not my father, and Aaron, you can cut that out of the tape later. And so all those things are part of who I am and shape who I am. And that's what I bring. It's that particularity that makes me beautiful. Makes me who I am. And when I say beautiful, I ain't just talking about how you look. Right? I'm talking about something deeper than that, how you look when I say beautiful. I'm talking about this idea of already being in the image of God despite it all. You see? So I'm going to say a little bit more about that, and then I'll say a few things that I want to encourage you to do. So when I look at my biography, and I think about how I want to encourage you to use certain resources. So I grew up in this tiny town called West Petersburg. You'll see how this comes together in a second. Called West Petersburg, Virginia, which was in between a larger town called Dinwiddie and Petersburg. Annexing issues caused us to have to, at one point, to have both a Dinwiddie address and a Petersburg address because we were in between. Well, as the two places fought, that affected who we were. For a long time, West Petersburg wasn't even on a map, but we knew it existed. Always got to watch out for that. We have countries and people say, well, it doesn't really exist, but the people who live there knows it exists. See, now watch that. As I grew up for an extended period of time, I was the second child, in between the youngest and the oldest brothers. As I moved into adulthood, I always had 1 foot in the church and 1 foot in the community, coming to terms with the surplus, which was the streets, in between the church and the community. So I want you to see that idea of in between this is something, right? Before I matriculated to college, I had to make one of 3 choices. And this is quite common for young black men and women. Either go where most of my friends went, which is the prison industrial complex, the military industrial complex, or the academic industrial complex. I ended up going in the military industrial complex. Why? Because being poor, working poor at least, I'm trying to find my own way to this education thing. And so for me, that meant the military, right? And when we think about what King was critiquing, he was critiquing why are most of the people serving in the military people of color? Now we see things happen in the military where people of color who have been at the top of the game being kicked out of positions, and more mediocre people are being put in those positions, right? So there's something really to think about. So I ended up going into the military industrial complex. As you can imagine, I went to the one in between those two. When I matriculated to college and turned to theology, I ended up working in between Carl Barth and James Cone. Barth, by the way, you say, well, what Carl Barth got to do with James Cone? James Cone did his master's thesis and his dissertation, and the first 2 books of black theology were shaped by Carl Barth. But I'm working in between, you see. When I met Charles Long, some people call the father of black religion, he's a historian of religion, I ended up being in between black theology and black religion. And one of the things that Long wrote in one of my books, he said, Raymond Carr, he said, and Long was real serious about this, don't conflate black religion and black theology. They're 2 different things. In fact, he said, don't conflate religion and theology. Right? Because sometimes we think theology and religion are the same thing. No, religion actually informs your theology when you define it like Charles Long defines it. We could always talk about that later if you have questions. So even now, I find myself as a theologian being deeply implicated in a theological existence in between the 2 prongs of the Reformation, between Luther with his emphasis on humanity and Calvin with his emphasis on the sovereignty of God. I find myself in between Catholics and Protestants. In between. And for this reason, one of the things that I needed in my work was a medium that helped me to deal with the surplus in between. I needed some way to get access to the excess, to all the different possibilities that we sometimes don't think about that are in between these different positions that we could be in. And that's where Thelonious Monk's music came in. And I always said, I did not discover Monk. Monk discovered me. You say, oh, he was long dead. But no, he discovered me because he gave me the framework to be able to think about who I am in all of that surplus. You all follow me? I just want to make sure you're with me. All right. Am I going too long so I need to cut off and we're going to come back up again after a song? All right. I may do that. But so let me just say a few things about this. So why Monk? And I want you to really think about this in terms of your own work when we talk about a hermeneutical situation. There's this writer by the name of Amos Wilder. He wrote a book, and the book is called Theopoetics. He's not talking about theology. He's talking about theopoetics, and that's where you have different art forms that informs your theology, informs your life. And one of the things he said was this: before the sermon, you have the song. Before the prose, you have the poem. And he said, well, before theology, you have the theopoetic. I think he's a little off there. Before the theology or the theopoetic, you have your experience, who you are. Before it's even put in any category, you got to deal with you. And there was one of my favorite thinkers, by the way, is a man by the name of William Stringfellow. And one of his favorite quotes that he said, and I'm going to say this quote, and then I'll save the rest for the next time I come up. He said, biography and history, any biography and every biography is inherently theological. In the sense that it contains already, literally by virtue of the incarnation, the good news of the gospel. Whether or not anyone discerns that. We are, each one of us, parables. You are a parable. The question is, what does your parable say? We'll talk more about that later.
Hello, everyone. Aaron Grizzell here. Wonderful to be with you and to be with a dear, dear friend and brother, Dr. Anthony Reddie, and to see all of you. I have the distinct privilege of serving as the executive director of the Northern California Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Community Foundation. And that foundation was founded by Dr. King's wife, the late Coretta Scott King, in order to serve as the official organization in the northern part of the state of California to honor her husband's legacy. Each year, we have a theme that runs with the foundation's work that we do. And this year, our theme is toward a more just union. Toward a more just union. It's very briefly, the framers of the United States Constitution created a preamble, created a mission statement, so to speak, that argued that if the people of the nation are to be united as a nation, 5 things are required. They are to establish justice, to ensure domestic tranquility, to provide for the common defense, to promote the general welfare, and to secure the blessings of liberty for ourselves and for our posterity. 5 things that are required for a people of the nation to become a united United States. That preamble to the Constitution is a high aspiration. It is a mission statement. It is a 5-part goal. It is what we are to strive for. It is a telos, so to speak. And yet, within the bowels of that Constitution, all human beings were not human beings. In the bowels of that Constitution, some human beings were deemed 3/5 of a human being. And yet this constituting document, this high work, was to be designed to bring the nation together. Dr. King thought differently about how we were to be a nation, how we were to be a people, how we were to be a family coming together. But it required us to wrestle with who we are as people. And part of his charge came from sacred scripture. Amos chapter 5. Let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. Justice, mishpat, that word that requires us to think about how we look at and treat each other. Righteousness, not righteousness as a God with us type of right living with God, but righteousness as a right living with each other. That was a part of the mission that Dr. King saw, and it required hard questions, and it required hard truths, and it required sacrifice. And so, for the foundation, the theme of toward a more just union harkens back to that message. That justice rolled down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream, because we as human beings need each other. Howard Thurman, one of Dr. King's mentors and one of the 20th century's great American creative theologians, said this: the safest place, physically, the safest place for a person to be is in another person's heart. Why? Why is it so safe? What makes my physical safety contingent upon your heart? Simply because if you find yourself thinking about your neighbor as you would think about yourself, you wouldn't want to hurt your neighbor. You wouldn't want to harm your neighbor. You could argue with your neighbor. You could wrestle with your neighbor. You could be mad at your neighbor. You can love and you can be happy and sad with your neighbor, but knowing that the greater good of your care for your neighbor is what wins out in the end. Dr. King called that, and the scriptures called that, agape love. That's the motive for a more just union. That's my work today. That's my work as an executive director of this august organization. And that's what I felt led to speak to you this evening. Amen.
Amen.
The International Colloquium Series, confronting global issues with moral clarity and intellectual depth.